You already know who invented the light bulb. Thomas Edison, 1879. Menlo Park, New Jersey. You learned it in school. You've seen the paintings. The lone inventor, late at night, holding up a glowing glass bulb, changing the world forever. It's a good story. It's also wrong. Not completely wrong. Not a lie, but not the full truth either. And the distance between the story we tell and the story that actually happened is more interesting than most people realize. Because the real story of the light bulb is not about one genius in a laboratory. It is about dozens of people across decades in multiple countries failing over and over again, until one man figured out not how to invent the light bulb, but how to make it work for everyone. That is a different thing entirely. And by the end of this, you will never think about a light switch the same way again. To understand why the light bulb mattered, you first have to understand what the world looked like without it. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a city in the 1840s. Not a peaceful, romantic city of cobblestones and candlelight. A real city, a working city. London, New York, Paris. The smell hits you first. Coal smoke, animal waste, rotting wood, river mud. The sound is next. Horses on stone, hammers, voices, and then the light, or rather, the absence of it. Because once the sun goes down, the city does not simply dim. It goes dark in a way that most of us alive today have never experienced. Not the soft darkness of a power outage you wait through, a deeper darkness, one that has no end time, one that simply stays. The only light available came from three sources: candles, oil lamps, and gas. Candles were expensive and unreliable. A single candle cast roughly the same light as a modern 5-watt bulb. Barely enough to read by, and only if you sat close. They dripped, they smoked, they burned down in hours. Wealthy households burned through dozens of candles a week. Poor households made do with almost none. Oil lamps were an improvement, but only slightly. They burned animal fat or whale oil, both of which were costly, both of which smelled. The whaling industry in the mid-1800s was enormous, in part because the world's appetite for lamp oil was insatiable. Hundreds of thousands of whales were killed every decade to keep the lamps burning. And still, the light was weak, inconsistent, dangerous. Gaslighting came next. By the 1840s, many major cities had networks of underground gas pipes feeding street lamps and, in wealthier homes, indoor fixtures. Gaslight was brighter than candles, steadier than oil. It was genuinely transformative for the people who could afford it. Walking through a gaslit street in Victorian London felt, to people of that era, almost magical. But gas had problems that no one could fully solve. It was dangerous. Gas leaks were common, and when they met an open flame, the results were catastrophic. Fires, explosions. Gaslight also produced heat, and it consumed oxygen. Sealed rooms became uncomfortable quickly. The light it gave off was yellowish and uneven, and it required a physical infrastructure, pipes, mains, distribution networks, that meant it would never reach the countryside, never reach the poor, never reach anywhere far from a city center. So when people in the mid-1800s began to dream of a better kind of light, they were not dreaming of luxury. They were dreaming of safety, of reliability, of a world where the night did not have to be an obstacle. And the idea they kept returning to, the idea that seemed, in theory, to offer all of those things, was electricity. The concept of electric light is older than most people think. As early as 1802, a British chemist named Humphrey Davy demonstrated that electricity could produce light. His method was not a bulb. It was an arc, a continuous spark of electricity jumping between two carbon rods, producing a brilliant, blinding white light. Davy's arc lamp was impressive enough to draw crowds of spectators. It was also completely impractical for everyday use. The arc was too bright for any room. It flickered constantly. The carbon rods burned away in minutes and had to be replaced. And the amount of electricity required was enormous for the technology of the time. But the demonstration proved something important. Electricity and light were connected. The question was not whether electric light was possible. The question was whether it could be made useful. For the next 50 years, inventors across Europe and America kept returning to that question. The challenge was to find a way to produce electric light that was steady, long-lasting, and safe enough to use indoors. The arc lamp was too violent, too bright, too hungry. What was needed was something softer, something enclosed, something that did not burn with an open flame, but glowed from within. The idea they kept arriving at was incandescence. Incandescence is what happens when a material is heated until it glows. Every fire you have ever seen is a form of incandescence. The filament of a light bulb glows because it is being heated by electricity passing through it, not burning, but glowing. The principle seems simple. The execution, it turned out, was one of the hardest engineering problems of the 19th century. The core difficulty was this: any material thin enough to glow brightly from electrical heating would also, under normal conditions, burn or disintegrate almost immediately. The moment it got hot enough to produce useful light, it would also get hot enough to destroy itself. The solution that eventually emerged was to enclose the filament in a glass bulb and remove the oxygen, to create a vacuum or something close to it, so that the material could glow without burning. But getting there required decades of failed experiments by people whose names most of us have never heard. In 1840, a British scientist named Warren de la Rue placed a platinum coil inside a glass tube and ran electricity through it. It glowed. It was, by any reasonable definition, an incandescent light. But platinum was extraordinarily expensive, and the bulb lasted only a short time before the platinum degraded. De la Rue understood the concept. He could not solve the economics. In 1850, a British physicist named Joseph Swan began experimenting with carbonized paper filaments inside evacuated glass tubes. Swan's work was serious, methodical, and genuinely advanced. By the early 1860s, he had produced working demonstrations of electric light. But the vacuum technology of the time was insufficient. Without a good enough vacuum, enough residual oxygen remained inside the bulb to quickly destroy the filament. Swan's bulbs worked briefly and then went dark. He kept working. In Germany in the 1850s and 60s, Heinrich Goebel, a German watchmaker who had emigrated to America, claimed to have built working incandescent bulbs using carbonized bamboo filaments inside glass tubes. His claims were disputed, taken to court, debated by historians for over a century. Whether Goebel truly built what he said he built, or whether his later memories were shaped by Edison's success, remains genuinely uncertain. But the fact that his claims were plausible, that no one could simply dismiss them, tells you something about how crowded this space was. In 1875, two Canadian inventors named Henry Woodward and Matthew Evans patented an electric lamp using a carbon rod between electrodes in a nitrogen-filled glass bulb. They demonstrated it publicly. They could not find investors. They could not scale it. 2 years later, they sold their patent. The buyer was Thomas Edison. This is not ancient history. This is not mythology. These were real people, working on the same problem, making real progress, and being stopped not by lack of intelligence or imagination, but by economics, by infrastructure, by the gap between a working prototype and a working product. And into this long, complicated, half-finished story walked a man who understood something that most of his predecessors had not. The problem was never just the bulb. Thomas Edison arrived at the problem of electric light in the late 1870s, and he arrived at it differently than everyone before him. By this point, Edison was already famous. His phonograph, the first device capable of recording and playing back sound, had made him internationally known. He had a laboratory, a team, funding, and something rarer than all of those, a particular way of thinking about problems. Edison did not think in inventions, he thought in systems. When he looked at the problem of electric light, he did not ask, "How do I build a better bulb?" He asked, "How do I build something that a city will pay for and a family will use?" Those are completely different questions. A better bulb was a technical problem. What Edison was solving was a commercial and infrastructural one. He wanted to create not a device, but a service, a complete electrical system that could be built, sold, expanded, and trusted. And that meant the bulb was only one piece of the puzzle, and not even the most important one. He needed generating stations that could produce electricity reliably. He needed distribution networks, wires, underground or overhead, that could carry electricity from those stations to buildings. He needed meters to measure how much electricity each customer used so they could be charged. He needed switches, fuses, connectors, insulation. He needed everything the bulb required in order to exist in the real world, not just in a laboratory. This is what Menlo Park was for. Not a single inventor working alone, but a team, machinists, chemists, mathematicians, engineers, working simultaneously on every part of the problem. Edison called it an invention factory, and he meant it literally. His goal was not discovery, it was production. And so in 1878, when Edison announced publicly that he was working on a practical system of electric light, before he had even solved the filament problem, he was doing something deliberate. He was setting expectations. He was telling investors and the public that this was not a dream, but a project with a timeline. The announcement caused the price of gas company stocks to drop immediately. People believed him. Whether they should have, at that moment, was a different question. The technical challenge that Edison and his team spent the most time on was the same one that had defeated everyone before them: the filament. Whatever material carried the electrical current had to be thin enough to heat to incandescence, stable enough to last more than a few minutes, and affordable enough to manufacture at scale. It also had to perform reliably inside a glass bulb from which almost all the air had been removed. Edison's team tested, by their own records, over 6,000 different materials, carbon in various forms, metals, organic fibers, hair, fishing line. The test was always the same: place the material in a bulb, evacuate the air, run current through it, and see how long it lasted before it failed. Most failed in minutes. Some lasted hours. A carbonized cotton thread, tested in October 1879, lasted approximately 13.5 hours. This was an improvement, but not enough. 13 hours was not a product. 13 hours was a demonstration. The team kept testing. Carbonized cardboard, carbonized wood, and eventually, almost by accident, carbonized bamboo. A strip of bamboo, taken from a fan in the Menlo Park laboratory, carbonized and placed inside a bulb, lasted over 1,000 hours. 1,000 hours of continuous light from a single filament in a single bulb. That was a product. In December 1879, Edison gave a public demonstration of his electric light system in Menlo Park. Hundreds of people came by train from New York City to watch. The laboratory and the surrounding area were lit by dozens of bulbs. The crowd stood in the winter night and looked at steady, warm, electric light, and they understood, in a way, that newspaper descriptions had not conveyed. This was real. A few weeks later, a reporter from the New York Herald wrote that the light was soft, mellow, and grateful to the eye, that it did not flicker, did not smell, did not require constant attention. Edison was not the first person to make an incandescent bulb, but he was the first person to make one that lasted long enough to be worth using. There is a complication. While Edison was conducting his tests in New Jersey, a man in Newcastle, England, was reaching the same conclusion by a different path. Joseph Swan, the same Joseph Swan who had been working on electric light since 1850, who had been stopped by inadequate vacuum technology, who had spent nearly 30 years on the problem, had in the mid-1870s gained access to better vacuum pumps. And with better pumps, he was able to produce a significantly improved version of his carbonized paper filament bulb. In February 1879, 9 months before Edison's famous October demonstration, Joseph Swan demonstrated his working incandescent light bulb to a packed audience of 700 people at the Literary and Philosophical Society of Newcastle upon Tyne. The bulb worked. The audience was astonished. Swan filed for a British patent. He began licensing his design. He lit his own home with electric light in 1880, making it one of the first private residences in the world to have electric lighting. He installed electric light in a theatre. He installed it in the Houses of Parliament. When Edison attempted to sell his system in Britain, Swan's prior patent stood in the way. The legal battle that followed was eventually settled not by the courts, but by a business arrangement. The two men merged their British operations into a single company. It was called, with elegant simplicity, the Edison and Swan United Electric Light Company. Ediswan, both names, because neither man could honestly claim sole credit. The history of the light bulb is not the story of one inventor. It is the story of a problem that many people worked on for many decades, and of two men, Swan in Britain, Edison in America, who arrived at the practical solution almost simultaneously from almost opposite directions, each building on the work of people who had come before them and received almost nothing in return. But here is where Edison's story becomes something larger. Joseph Swan invented a working light bulb. He did not invent electric light as a service. Edison understood, with a clarity that none of his contemporaries quite matched, that the bulb alone was useless. A light bulb without electricity is a glass ornament, and electricity without a reliable delivery system is a laboratory curiosity. What Edison built, beginning in 1880 and completing in September 1882, was the first commercial electrical power system in the world. The Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan was not impressive to look at. A converted building on Pearl Street in the financial district, filled with 6 enormous dynamos, generators, connected by underground cables to buildings in a roughly 1-mile radius. On the 4th of September, 1882, Edison himself threw the switch. 85 buildings in Lower Manhattan received electric light for the first time. The offices of J.P. Morgan, one of Edison's investors, were among the first. Morgan reportedly kept his electric lights on even during daylight hours, simply because he could. Within a year, the Pearl Street station was serving over 500 customers. Within 2 years, over 1,000. The system worked not because the technology was perfect, it was not, but because it was designed, from the beginning, to be a business. Customers paid per unit of electricity used. The meters that measured their usage were another Edison invention. The infrastructure that carried the electricity was engineered, maintained, and expanded by a dedicated staff. Edison did not invent the light bulb. He invented the light switch, and the meter, and the underground cable, and the generating station, and the organizational structure that made all of it run. He invented, in other words, the idea that electricity was something you could buy. There is a tension at the heart of this story that is worth sitting with. The people who first imagined electric light, Humphrey Davy, Warren de la Rue, Joseph Swan, the dozens of others who spent years and personal fortunes on the problem, were driven by something close to pure curiosity. They wanted to know whether it was possible. They wanted to understand the science. Many of them were not thinking primarily about money. Edison was always thinking about money, not because he was greedy or cynical, but because he understood something that the scientists often did not. An invention that no one can afford, or no one can access, or no one can reliably use is not yet an invention. It is a possibility, a sketch, a prototype in a glass case. The transition from possibility to product is not a footnote. It is, in many cases, the main event. And yet there is something uncomfortable about this, because the people who did the earlier work, who proved it was possible, who solved the theoretical problems, who sacrificed years of their lives on ideas they could not quite complete, often received very little. Not just little credit, little money, little recognition. Their names appear in footnotes, if they appear at all. History, it turns out, is not always kind to the people who came second to last. Warren de la Rue died respected, but not famous. Joseph Swan, despite his priority, spent years in litigation and ultimately had to share his credit. Henry Woodward and Matthew Evans sold their patent and watched another man become a legend, partly on the back of their work. This is not unique to the light bulb. It is a pattern that repeats across the history of technology. The person who solves the final problem, who takes a near-complete idea and makes it work, tends to receive most of the credit for all the steps that came before. Is that fair? Perhaps not. Is it understandable? Almost certainly. We remember the version that changed the world, and the version that changed the world was the one that worked well enough, reliably enough, cheaply enough, and soon enough to reach the people who needed it. It is worth noting that Edison himself was not always comfortable with the mythology that built up around him. Late in his life, he reportedly said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." The quote is famous, but less famous is the implied acknowledgement beneath it, that the path to any working invention is paved with the failures of many people, himself included. Edison knew he had not started from nothing. He had bought patents. He had hired the best engineers in the country. He had access to funding that allowed him to run thousands of tests where others could afford to run dozens. He had, in George Westinghouse, in J.P. Morgan, in the infrastructure of American industrial capitalism, a context that made his particular kind of innovation possible. He was not modest about his achievements, but he was, on his better days, honest about what they were. He told an interviewer in 1883, "The electric light has caused me the greatest amount of study and has required the most elaborate experiments. Not the most creative experiments, the most elaborate, the most systematic, the most industrial." That is what Edison did. He industrialized invention itself. And the light bulb, that simple, ordinary object that has come to symbolize the very concept of a new idea, was his greatest example of that process. You flip a switch, light appears. It takes no thought, no effort, no awareness of what stands behind it. The 200 years of failed experiments, the scientists who died without recognition, the businessmen who saw something others missed, the engineers who tested 6,000 filaments and kept testing. The light just comes on. And that, in a way, is the most remarkable thing about it. Not that it exists, but that it is so ordinary now, so expected, so invisible. A candle in 1840 was a small miracle. People saved them, rationed them, carried them carefully through the wind. A gas lamp in 1860 was a symbol of modernity, something to be proud of, to show guests, to mention in letters. An electric bulb in 2024 is something you replace twice a year and never think about. The distance between those two things, between the fragile, precious candle of 1840 and the taken-for-granted bulb of today, is the distance of 200 years of human effort. Thousands of people, most of whom you will never know, working on a problem they did not fully understand toward a solution they could not quite see. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb. He invented the conditions under which the light bulb could exist in every home, on every street, in every corner of the world that had access to electricity. That is a different thing, a harder thing, perhaps in the end, a more important thing. History remembers the version that worked, not always the one that started it. And behind every switch you will ever touch, every room you will ever illuminate, every night you will ever push back with the click of a button, behind all of it, stretching back further than you probably thought, is a story that is much longer, much stranger, and much more human than the one you were told in school. Now you know a little more of it.